Thanks. Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Mia Tamburi, the Program Director of Cancer Bridges and a member of the Education and Outreach Work Group for the Cancer and Environment Network of Southwestern Pennsylvania. Today's presentation is on pesticides, the environmental and health impacts on children and workers. This speaker series is a project of the Education and Outreach Work Group for Cancer and Environment Network of Southwestern Pennsylvania, which is a network of organizations and individuals who are concerned about environmental chemicals and how they are contributing to our region's high rate of cancer. Cancer Bridges is co-sponsoring today's webinar. At Cancer Bridges, we provide free support for those impacted by cancer, including counseling, support groups, health and wellness classes, family and youth activities, and much more. Our website can be found in the chat, www.cancerbridges.org. If you happen to get disconnected, please log back into the webinar. And if you need technical assistance, you can message via the chat box to Andre. His name is also listed below in the chat. Also, please enter your questions and comments in the chat box throughout the presentation. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be available on both the Cancer Bridges and SenseBA's websites. At this time, I'd like to introduce our speakers, Jay Feldman and Akela Bracey. Jay is the co-founder of the organization and has served as director since 1981. Jay dedicated himself to finding solutions to pesticide problems after working with farm workers and small farmers through an EPA grant in 1978 to the National Advocacy Organization Rural America. Since that time, Jay has helped build Beyond Pesticides capacity to assist local groups and impact national pesticide policy. He has tracked specific chemical effects, regulatory actions, and pesticide laws. He is very familiar with local groups working on pesticides and helped develop successful strategies for reform in local communities. His work with media has helped to bring broader public understanding of the hazards of pesticides. Jay has a master's in urban and regional planning with a focus on health policy from Virginia Polytech Institute and State University, and a BA from Grinnell College in political science. In September 2009, U.S. Department of Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack appointed Jay to the National Organic Standards Board, where he completed a 5-year term in January of 2015. Akela Bracey is a Cornell University graduate with a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental and Sustainable Sciences with a concentration on environmental biology and applied ecology, and a minor in animal science. Her love for the environment stems from a passion for helping animals. Akela was a teaching assistant for 2 years at Cornell, gaining sustainable development and planning skills, as well as ecological knowledge on North America woody plant species. She also worked very closely with arachnids, participating in study comparing various Australian huntsman spiders' running speed. Before heading to college, Akela volunteered at Little Rascals, a local Washington, D.C. dog daycare for 4 years. In her spare time, she likes to write, cook, swim, and sketch realistic portraits and landscapes. Thank you, Jay and Akela, for being here today. Turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. So we're going to get started with the presentation on pesticides and health, the health impacts of workers, residents, and children. So we are all too often involuntarily exposed to a plethora of chemicals, whether it be from work, school, public areas, or even in our own food or water resources. Acute and chronic exposure to chemicals like pesticides can cause various harmful effects. Even general exposure to minimal concentrations of these chemicals can cause cancer, neurotoxicity, and developmental disabilities, reproductive and birth defects, respiratory illnesses, endocrine disruption, and immune disruption. Additionally, exposure to these toxic pesticides can weaken the body's immune response to illnesses, creating an environment for underlying conditions like respiratory illnesses such as asthma or endocrine disruption problems like diabetes to flourish among vulnerable individuals. However, today we will focus on one of the most prolific diseases associated with pesticide use and exposure, and that is cancer. When we think of pesticides, we think of companies using chemicals to control pests. Many people picture planes flying overhead or trucks driving by or tractors in agricultural fields spraying a concoction of chemicals, mixing the land in a suffocating fog. Others may picture the products they or others may use on their lawn and garden for aesthetic purposes. However, what if I tell you that the chemicals that you use in your home every day are just as toxic? Household cleaners, including disinfectants, antimicrobial products, personal care products, cosmetics, household bug killers like Raid, bug repellents like Off, rat or mouse pellets, and even pet shampoos and pet collars can all contain toxic chemicals. As you can see, pesticide use is widespread. Therefore, pesticide pollution and residues are also ubiquitous, contaminating various ecosystems that in turn indirectly propagate pesticide exposure globally. You know the saying, April showers brings May flowers, reminding those that a period of discomfort can provide the basis for a period of happiness and joy. However, April showers also brings pesticides, as chemical runoff from agricultural fields, urban and suburban areas, and industrial plants can readily contaminate water and soil resources. According to the USGS survey, pesticides are present in all rivers and streams in detectable amount, with over 90% of these samples containing 5 or more pesticide compounds or metabolites. Groundwater contamination mainly stems from leaching of pesticides from soil. However, some pesticides can bind to the soil and accumulate to toxic concentrations. This is seen in both conventional and organic farming, as reports find traces of legacy banned pesticides like DDT in soils, as these chemicals are stable compounds with long half-lives and slow breakdown times. Even widely used pesticides like glyphosate are found in soils where they were never used. Additionally, some pesticides are systemic, meaning plant roots and leaves uptake these chemicals into their vascular system, so there's no real way to remove the pesticide product like washing it off. Unfortunately, just as soils can accumulate toxic pesticides, so can our food sources. Although systemic pesticides demonstrate the most obvious example of residue contamination on crops, less obvious resources include pesticides detected in the tissue and meat of animal and dairy products from livestock consuming contaminated animal feed. Furthermore, farm fish that use pesticides to kill fish lice and sustain fish population are often exposed to chemicals in the open ocean. And not only does this have an impact on the aquatic organisms that frequent these areas, but it can bioaccumulate in the tissue of larger fish that we consume, and contaminated prey can also be consumed, having a bottom-up effect on the ecosystem structure. Lastly, the climate crisis has had implications for the reemergence of pesticides entrapped in ice and snow on glaciers and Arctic regions. Glacial melt can re-release trapped pesticides into the environment, not only into the water, but into the atmosphere. And if these pesticides are small enough to travel towards the Arctic, they are small enough to travel away from the Arctic as global warming increases. So as widespread as pesticide exposure is, many people can encounter overlapping exposure to chemicals, increasing adverse health risks. From direct applications with occupational exposures, people may be exposed to chemicals that can impact their 5 senses, cause various types of cancers that are higher risk than the general population, and a lot of kidney and liver disease, as those are the mechanisms to remove toxins from the body. Additionally, you also have direct application and residue exposure in residential areas. So the uses of disinfectants around the home, anything for self-gardening, and even pet flea products can also put people at risk, as they're exposed to both the direct application from the chemical itself as well as residues that remain. However, since pesticides can drift from a point source, farm workers and landscapers' clothing, shoes, dust, and carpets can even additionally drag these chemicals into residential households. So that's another source. And lastly, there's co-exposure. So co-exposure can happen from direct application and indirect application and residues. And general public and workers alike can both encounter these types of exposures. And these exposures can happen in public areas, and one has less control over what chemical they encounter compared to what they encounter in their own home. Thus, co-exposure increases adverse health risk among multiple sources of contamination. So when we're going to talk about the science, we want to talk about the mechanisms that we use. So Beyond Pesticides has many different resources on the science behind pesticides in human, animal, and environmental health. As a based organization, it is significant for us to maintain an up-to-date database of scientific studies, reviews, regulatory statuses, and agency decisions on pesticides. It can often be difficult to find information in one place, especially if when EPA classifies health and environmental effects differently from other academic or government research agencies. So we use our Gateway on Pesticide Hazards and Safe Pest Management as a tool to provide decision policymakers, practitioner activists, and even the general public with easier access to current and historical information on pesticide hazards. This draws the links to numerous sources and organizations that include information related to the science, policy, and activism with pesticides. With over 300 active ingredients, this valuable resource can be used by the general public to search products' name, chemical name, and even health and environmental effects. In our pesticide-induced disease database, this facilitates access to epidemiological and laboratory studies based on real-world exposure scenarios that link public health effects to pesticides. The scientific literature documents elevated rates of chronic diseases among people exposed to pesticides, with increasing numbers of studies associated with both specific illnesses and a range of illnesses. This is a valuable resource of peer-reviewed studies that are provided for users with easy access to over 1,300 studies related to pesticide and health concerns. So when we talk about pesticides in general, by nature, pesticides is designed to kill, and because of its toxicity, it must undergo registration. But you have to realize that pesticide exposure itself does not discriminate, as these toxic chemicals can impact the health of men, women, and children alike. 90% of all US citizens have one detectable pesticide in their body, whether it's a current use pesticide or even a pesticide that has been long banned. However, pesticide exposure tends to affect people differently via race, sex, and health concerns. However, the effect on the general public include neurotoxicity, different cancers, pulmonary illnesses, among others. However, endocrine disruption encompasses many organs, as the interconnectedness of the endocrine system to normal bodily function is crucial in understanding the resulting health effects from chemical exposure. So when we're talking about how these pesticides impact different communities, among men, most men are pesticide applicators, between 88.9% to 92.6%. And the average age is 40 years old, which has implications for chronic health effects, especially as one gets older. Some things that are specific to men are prostate cancer and testicular cancer, and also reproductive dysfunction such as low sperm count, low sperm mobility that can ultimately lead to infertility. For women, there are many studies showcasing the sex-specific differences. For instance, a 2020 study reveals that exposure to organophosphates, which are acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, can cause sex-specific differences in depression symptoms, so neurotoxicity, among adolescent girls through endocrine disruption. Additionally, there are other specific effects to women, such as breast and ovarian cancer, as well as reproductive effects, including preterm birth, early onset menopause, and spontaneous abortion and infertility. It's important to know that early onset menopause can also be an indicator of an increase in breast cancer risk. Additionally, women have a unique exposure patterns that they can transfer to their children, as breast milk is often contaminated with pesticides. That way, in pregnancy, women can transfer chemicals they encounter to the fetus via the umbilical cord. And for children, preconceptive, in utero, and early life exposure are some of the most vulnerable life stages, as children's bodies are small relative to adults and do not have the adequate mechanisms to alleviate toxicity. However, both male and female can experience increase in health risk before contraception. So this is even before pregnancy. And some specific effects on children are low birth weight, organ malformation, developmental delays like autism, ADD, and ADHD, and which ADD and ADHD can actually disproportionately affect boys more than girls. Reproductive dysfunction like early onset and a delay in puberty, and additionally an early onset in puberty has links to higher risk of breast or prostate cancer later in life. So now we're going to go into general cancer statistics. About 1 in 2 men, 1 in 3 women, and 1 in 263 children under the age of 20 will be diagnosed or have a cancer diagnosis, resulting in 1 in 5 men, 1 in 6 women, and 1 in 10 children dying from cancer. The number of people that are diagnosed with cancer will increase by nearly 50% by 2040. So the 19.3 million incidents from 2020 will increase to 30.2 million in 2022. This also showcases that there are about 10 million deaths that occur in 2020. So that way in 2040, we can assume that there will be 20 million deaths, 50% increase. So we can look here and see that our most common forms of cancer are breast cancer, lung cancer, and prostate cancer. However, the highest mortality is for lung cancer, stomach, and liver cancer. So the most common form of cancer is breast cancer that has the highest mortality. That's behind colorectal cancer. And this is the direct association with pesticides. So we also are using a 40 commonly used lawn and landscape chemical list, which comprises EPA and peer-reviewed scientific literature and showcases the pesticides you're more likely to encounter in the everyday environment because these uses are not restricted. For instance, malathion has links to cancer, but is one of the most widely used mosquito controls, especially for wide-scale residential treatments to prevent vector diseases. So as you can see, 63% or 26 out of the 40 have links to cancer. Studies, reports, and the US EPA show that hundreds of thousands of chemicals influence cancer risk. However, EPA does not take into account every single risk. By nature, a pesticide is designed to kill, and because of its toxicity, it does undergo registration under the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. Even pesticide breakdown products or metabolites can be significantly more harmful than the pesticide itself. However, not all pesticides have to undergo registration, as 25B minimum risk pesticides are considered low risk, void of synthetic chemicals as active ingredients, and all ingredients must be displayed on the label. But by knowing this, we know that at least 45 different cancers have associations with birth-related pesticides that EPA may not accurately capture in their risk assessment. So if, for instance, our categorizations, we see that EPA and IR categorize these chemicals, glyphosate, which is in Roundup, differently. Before, US EPA used to classify glyphosate as suggestive, carcinogenic to humans, but they changed that based on agency data. However, IARC has another independent research, and they found it's carcinogenic to humans. And this is normally what people would go by IARC because it's not influenced by industry data. However, they can still share similar outcomes. So pentachlorophenol, which is a wood preservative, are both categorized as the same carcinogenic risk to humans. Chronic exposure or continuous exposure to cancers, whether it be an occupation or just general exposure, can increase the risk because it's a latent disease. But cancer risk doesn't seem to be limited to one functional class of pesticides like herbicides, insecticides, or fungicides. And it is not specific to one chemical class like organochlorines or organophosphates or atrazine trazines. So our focus from science literature is going to be on hormone or estrogen-mediated cancers, blood cancers, and childhood cancers. So I'm going to use an example, and I'll use organophosphates. So organophosphates exhibit endocrine disrupting properties that may alter estrogen or even testosterone activity receptors, resulting in differences in clearance rates of toxicity of organophosphates. Among the general population, organophosphate exposure can cause an increased risk of total cancers for all female non-smokers, breast cancer for female smokers, and prostate cancer for male smokers. So when we go specifically into these effects, ovarian cancer and breast cancer are some of the most prominent hormone-related cancers in relation to pesticide exposure. 1 in 7 women will receive a diagnosis, and 1 in 108 will die of ovarian cancer, while 1 in 8 will receive a breast cancer diagnosis, and 1 in 39 will die of breast cancer. Genetics for both only account for a small percentage of risk for breast cancer. Thus, environmental exposure and socioeconomic factors significantly play a large role in hormone-related cancers. There are grave concerns also on pollutants effects, especially for organochlorines, as organochlorines remain in the environment for a while, such as DDT. However, there are 296 chemicals in consumer products that can increase the breast cancer risk through endocrine disruption. So it's essential to understand how chemical exposure can impact chronic disease occurrence. Additionally, there are some disproportionate risk and unique risk along with breast cancer. Breast cancer outcomes differ slightly among women of various races, ethnicities, with African Americans being 40% more likely to die from breast cancer than women of any other race. And uniquely, a study on male breast cancer in Scotland reports an alarming increase in this rare disease, because although only 1% of diagnosed breast cancer are usually male cancer, it's often difficult or delayed to diagnose, and there's a lack of research or male-specific treatment, leading to often higher fertility rates. Additionally, for other hormone-related cancers, we have prostate cancer, we have testicular cancer. Prostate cancer, 1 in 8 men will receive a diagnosis, and 1 in 41 men will die of prostate cancer. Additionally, 1 in 250 men will receive a testicular cancer diagnosis, and 1 in 5,000 will die of cancer. One example of this can be associated with atrazine. Atrazine has an 8.4-fold increase in prostate cancer in men who work in factories with atrazine or bag or produce these toxic chemicals. Additionally, prostate cancer occurs mainly in men without a family history, and genetics only counts for a small percentage. And although genetics counts for 50% of testicular cancer, there has been an increase in these cancer rates over time that cannot be explained by genetic risk factors. Thus, similarly, environmental exposure and socioeconomic factors significantly impact hormone cancer risk. Work-related pesticide exposure equals elevated prostate and testicular cancer risk. And this is something commonly seen in occupational workers. Now for blood cancers. We have lymphomas, which includes non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and occupational exposure to glyphosate can increase non-Hodgkin lymphoma risk by 41%. Non-Hodgkin lymphoma is actually one of the most widely studied cancers in relations to pesticide, from old pesticides like organochlorines like DDT and newer generations of pesticides like 2,4-D, diazon, and glyphosate. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma additionally can also be glyphosate also have co-formulations with 2,4-D and Roundup, and these co-formulations can also pose an extra risk in developing these cancers. For leukemias, we have acute childhood leukemia, which is rare but is increasing among adolescents over the last 30 years, most likely due to outside external or environmental factors that has no relations to genetics. For multiple myeloma or cancer of the white blood cells, long-term exposure to the pyrethroid insecticide permethrin and organochlorines like dieldrin and lindane increase the risk of of developing MDUS, which is a blood precursor for multiple myeloma. And higher rates of these blood cancers are among agricultural workers, and it disproportionately affects females more than males. And this is unique because female workers, typically you wouldn't see higher rates of multiple myeloma because it affects men more. However, now it's affecting women more, there has to be an underlying mechanism. For childhood cancers, cancer is the #1 cause of non-accidental deaths among children. And 60% of children who do survive cancer experience severe to life-threatening chronic illnesses later on in life. So there's acute childhood leukemias, and the risk of leukemia increases with prenatal and newborn exposure to pesticides. So as a mother is pregnant, her exposure to these pesticides can increase the risk of developing leukemia. Additionally, mothers who use pesticides in the home while pregnant put their child at a 1.4 time risk of developing brain tumors or brain cancer under the age of 15. Additionally, for Wilms tumor or kidney cancer, a rare type of kidney cancer, household cleaner use during pregnancy can increase the risk of this cancer in newborns and young children under the age of 15. There are also multi-generational effects. And you should understand that these generational effects can affect anyone from the grandmother to the grandchild and even further down the line. So DDT was banned in 1972 and after 32 years on the market. So there are generations alive now that are still at risk of cancer exposure because of past use of DDT. As before, DDT is a stable chemical and it doesn't break down in the environment easily. It can easily stay in the environment for up to hundreds of years. Thus, a mother's exposure during pregnancy increases the breast cancer and cardiometabolic disorder risk for up to 3 successive generations. However, you have to realize that we keep making the same mistakes and this problem still persists with current pesticides we use to this day, such as organophosphates, glyphosate, and these multi-general effects can have negligible observable effects on the mother or on the pregnant rodent, but severe effects on the 2 subsequent generations when looking at epidemiological studies. And these impacts also not only include cancer, but also reproductive effects, kidney disease, obesity, and birth abnormalities. So now we could talk about the possible mechanisms involved. Although genetics can put people at elevated risk of cancer, that is not the only etiology of cancer incidence, as genetics cannot account for the discrepancies. So there's endocrine disruption, and this is the connection of hormone-related cancer prognosis, and it mimics hormones like estrogen, testosterone, androgen that attaches to the receptors. And one of the most well-studied mechanisms for epidemiological studies, but one of the least evaluated by EPA, is endocrine disruption. Endocrine disruption is one of the most prolific pesticides or chemicals associated with xenoestrogenic compounds. And the estrogenic strength of pesticides and environmental half-life exceeds those of other estrogenic compounds, increasing the risk when exposed to these compounds. Additionally, with endocrine disruption, because it can impact all parts of the body, it's not limited to one specific part. The endocrine system is complex and interconnected to other bodily systems, so it can affect the heart, motor function, ocular function, all the senses equally. Additionally, some other mechanisms involved include oxidative stress, which is involved in DNA damage, increase in small RNA, which is apparent in glyphosate, and leukemia and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Additionally, new reports on atropine and cell proliferation showcase an increased risk of triple-negative breast cancer that can be difficult to diagnose. But now we are on to the solutions. Various epidemiological studies highlight health effects that EPA overlooks and does not test for. The notion that benefit of pesticides outweigh risks to health is flawed. And this is evident with the over 1,300 studies in our PID database showcasing diseases and illnesses related to pesticide exposure that are not captured by EPA. So all of these you could see are things that EPA does not consider when doing risk assessment. As you can see, past pesticide regulations, such as the FIFRA, use risk-benefit standard for hazards on pesticide exposure. However, this risk-benefit approach had an inherent assumption that there was some acceptable risk of hazard if a chemical has value or benefit. Even under a health-based standard, risk assessments that calculate acceptable risk across the population group do not disclose the disproportionate effect of pesticide use on people of color communities and occupational exposures who may experience co-exposure to these pesticides. Although the act was amended with the Food Quality Protection Act to protect infants and children from exposure, federal pesticide laws that aim to categorize disproportionate harm still allow elevated risks to workers, particularly farm workers and landscapers who are people of color and who experience the aggregate effect of pesticide exposure from multiple sources. And this is commonly seen as some cases that we will go over next. So some notable rulings include Dwayne Johnson, who developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma through his groundkeeping work, so occupationally, and was awarded $78 million in damages. Edwin Hardman also developed non-Hodgkin lymphoma following decades of Roundup use on his property. So this is essentially residential use, not even occupational use. And he was awarded $80 million in damages. And most recently, a jury found Monsanto responsible for the adverse effects of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma associated with Roundup and awarded the plaintiffs $87 million. The commonality among all of these is that everybody developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and that has a direct correlation or connection with Roundup and the active ingredient glyphosate. So that's why we must switch to the organic solution. And I'll pass it off to Jay.
You're muted, Jay.
Thanks so much, Akela. That's just great foundational stuff around sort of how we got to where we are right now. Let me just briefly give you a little bit of history. Switch to organic is sort of the theme here, but it's really, for us, it's more of a systemic sort of looking at the kinds of issues that Akela discussed, peeling back the issues, but also looking at this through a broader, wider lens and asking what are the underlying deficiencies in the way we think about toxic chemical introduction to society, given the range of adverse effects that we're aware of, given the uncertainties, the limitations in knowledge, that slide that Akela had up around the limitations under FIFRA and the FQPA, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and amendments under the Food Quality Protection Act really show us that we don't have a very good handle on, at least from a regulatory and statutory standpoint, on mitigating risks in a way that are adequately protective, at least under our definition of adequate. And so given the nature of the science, given what we do know and what we don't know, given the limitations of risk assessment, we sat down, looked at FIFRA, we looked at FQPA, we looked at all of this stuff, and we began basically thinking about how we could institutionalize a different approach to getting at why we introduced pesticides in the first place. What are the needs? What are the underlying dependencies that we are trying to address? So Kayla mentioned the ranges of uses, household uses, agricultural uses, public health uses. These are all regulated under FIFRA or amendments to FIFRA and the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And we came up with organic as a methodology as sort of a systemic approach to evaluating the outcomes we were looking for in terms of management. Can we manage, in terms of food production, the range of insect problems, weed problems, fungicide, fungal problems? How do we do that without dependency on these toxic chemicals? And that's what we've been working on since the development and then the adoption of the Organic Foods Production Act. So under the Act, the Organic Foods Production Act, we literally have a parallel system of evaluating allowable materials. And these materials are supposed to not have adverse effects on health or the environment, based on an evaluation of cradle to grave. So we're looking at adverse impacts during the development of manufacturing materials, the mining of materials, what goes into the process entailed in that, all through the chain of production, transportation, handling, use, and disposal. And under the Organic Foods Production Act, we are supposed to look at all those areas. So it would take in occupational exposures. It would take in population groups that are adversely affected. And in that system of review, we're also looking at compatibility with organic systems. So we're looking at impacts on biodiversity. We're looking at impacts on health at all levels. We're looking at issues like climate impacts. And that's how we come up with this list it's called the National List of Allowed and Prohibited Substances. Now, what we'd like to see in the development of that list is much more engagement from the scientific community. I mean, when I sat on that board, we had one scientist on the board. It's a very transparent public, process. And manufacturers are constantly coming to this board like they do with EPA. And they're saying, we would like our material to be on your list so that it can be used in certified organic production. This law that we wrote back in 1990 created that seal you see in the grocery store, USDA Organic. It entails not only this process of creating a national list of allowed and prohibited substances, it also has a certification and inspection system, which we don't see on the non-organic side in conventional agriculture. So there's a whole system in place. And the point I'm trying to make is, because of the limitations that Akela talked about, and a lot of what Akela's been presenting, really, as you all know, has been written about extensively and evaluated by the U.S. General Accounting Office, by the Inspector General, by independent scientific research. And over and over and over again, over the decades, we've seen deficiencies as we look at individual chemicals. And many of you, like myself, we have looked at these individual chemicals and tried to bring science into the deliberations. We even tried to bring science into the Food Quality Protection Act back in 1996. And we required EPA to look at endocrine disruption. And we still, since 1996, do not have a protocol for evaluating endocrine disruptors in the regulatory process. So that becomes a huge gap in our knowledge, especially given what the independent scientific literature, as Akela discussed, is telling us about the endocrine system and the mechanism at work in looking at exposures during critical windows of vulnerability rather than elevated dose responses throughout our lifetime. And that difference, sort of moving from classical toxicology to looking at inverse dose response curves, and when we're seeing greater effect at minute doses, is something EPA has not grappled with from a regulatory standpoint. Well, what does that mean? We're seeing multi-generational effects, transgenerational effects, and we're still not studying and incorporating into our decisions. So we can bypass all that with the organic system. Well, you might ask, is it viable? Is it economically viable? Is it productive? Is it profitable? And through the decades, the answer has become yes in every food commodity group, and so forth and so on. We've also taken the principles in organic, which is really a systems-based approach to soil management, soil health, recognizing that our current systems where we introduce chemicals have really, they can have trophic effects throughout the environment, but they have counter effects in terms of what we call ecosystem services. So we're depressing predator populations that are necessary for ecological balance and ecosystem balance that is necessary to produce food, to manage ecosystems, et cetera. And so we're taking those theories and we're applying them to non-agricultural settings, like our playing fields, our parks, our home gardens, and so forth. And in fact, we've been working with Pittsburgh on this for the park system to basically incorporate an organic approach that is really no longer dependent on these toxic inputs. So we're talking here about a change in orientation, a recognition of principles that are critical to management of ecological systems that we partner with in nature. And in partnering with nature, we reduce and then eliminate our reliance on these pesticides. If you don't mind, Kayla, let me just share this screen for a moment, and then we'll come back to you to finish out the presentation. What I wanted to do was share the latest issue of our journal. As many of you may know, let's see, we have a journal called Pesticides. Let me see if I can get this thing bigger here. Why is this not happening? Anyway, it's called Pesticides and You. During this whole period of coronavirus, we haven't gotten it out quarterly as much, so we've been doing these annual issues. And the reason I'm showing you this is because the same kind of information that Kayla has provided relative to cancer and endpoints related to human health we're seeing the same pattern of failure of the regulatory system across the ecosystem. So we as an organization are looking at health, biodiversity, and climate and evaluating the intersection of petrochemical pesticides and fertilizers in these contexts. And it's sort of frightening to realize that looking at a year of scientific literature and action and breaking it down into these areas of threats, and we call them crises. We see a crisis, what Kayla is describing in human health threats. So we've divided those down into children's environmental health. The literature is just steeped in this. A lot of pediatric cancer issues are coming up, our early onset of puberty, autism. We're looking at gut microbiome and the impacts that have in the brain-gut relationship, but all systems in the body, of course. We're looking at the intersection. Kayla put up the slide of the pesticide-induced diseases database, Parkinson's disease, multi-generational effects. We mentioned our global footprint and what that means in terms of dependency, endocrine disruption, of course, we've mentioned. And then we're looking at the same kind of science around biodiversity. As you may know, the UN has basically said we're headed for biodiversity collapse over the next 30, 40, maybe if we're lucky, 50 years. We've got an insect apocalypse. We cannot survive without insects in the environment. And we look at all those biodiversity impacts as well. And in addition, of course, climate. The reason we take on petrochemicals broadly, not only pesticides, but fertilizers, is because the two go hand in hand in this system. If you're dependent on pesticides, carcinogenic pesticides, to grow your food, you're also dependent on synthetic fertilizers to grow your food. You can't do one without the other. You can't take pesticides out of the system and continue to grow and continue with the synthetic fertilizers and then adopt an organic system, because you've killed off all the microbial life in the soil and you don't cycle nutrients naturally to replace the pesticides. And in addition to that, you've created vulnerability, just like you have in the human population. You've created that vulnerability in your plant population so that it's more vulnerable to disease and infestation and that kind of thing. So we have to look holistically. If we're challenging a threat to human health and we're looking for a solution that's no longer dependent on a chemical that contributes to that human health threat, then we have to look at the system behind the dependency on that chemical. We can't just say to EPA, take this chemical out of the system, because we're going to get the economic pushback from the industry, be it an agricultural industry or the landscape industry or the public health, like the mosquito management people. They're all going to push back and say, when you take that chemical out of the system, we will no longer be able to manage the agricultural system or the public health, disease vectors or the landscape in our communities. And they're correct, because those systems are built to be dependent on those chemicals. And so what we have to get EPA and our regulators to do is to step back and ask the question, as we're doing on the organic side, what are the systems that are contributing to the dependency? And when we take this carcinogen or this carcinogenic substance out of the system, what do we have to be prepared to do as a society and as a regulator to advance the alternatives that can replace that system? We do a very poor job when we look at that carcinogen of looking at the alternatives as a part of that regulatory system. So we have a lot of work to do when it comes to fixing the regulatory system that's just focused on risk mitigation and not at the same time focused on the viability of alternatives that can replace that carcinogen that we're evaluating. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. We have created systems that are dependent on that carcinogen, and our analysis, if narrow, every time results in a benefit that exceeds the risk calculation. So we have all these identified risks out there by EPA, and Akela put up that chart of the 40 most commonly used chemicals in landscape management. EPA knows all this. A lot of this information comes out of EPA's files. They know there's a carcinogenic risk. They know there are multiple exposures. They know there's a common mechanism of toxicity, but in their mind, the risks are outweighed by the benefits in a chemical dependent system. So that's the story on the alternatives. We're really, really excited about the viability of these alternatives. We just have to get the scientific community in greater alignment with the alternatives. The American Academy of Pediatrics, as you may know, has for many years now really pointed to organic as a solution for pediatric cancer when they're looking at a solution. So they have really entered that debate as to how do we get off the treadmill, how do we step back and eliminate these chemicals, and how do we reduce the toxic load that we know people, children are carrying as a result of the residues that are in our water, in our food, in our air, and also some of the transgenerational burden that we carry as a result of these chemicals. We are in a period of time now, I think, where the urgency of what we're all doing here, the folks in this network, what we're all doing, the urgency, I think now is felt to a greater degree than ever before, given the kinds of studies we're seeing, both in terms of health, but also in terms of biodiversity and climate, that we have the attention of the public. And we have to come up with what we call transformative solutions. The fix is not in more mitigation measures, because I think at the end of the day, if we were to put that chart back up of all the limitations associated with risk assessment, we would find that the cost of doing these kind of evaluations are so astronomical that we would never generate the commitment from Congress or the agencies to do this kind of analysis that would really be required to do the kind of full analysis and robust review that would be needed. I'll give you one last example, and then I'll turn it back to Akela. As we went through COVID, you know, we're still going through COVID, but as we went through the sort of peak of COVID, the messages we kept hearing out of the CDC and our state public health departments was that we had certain at-risk populations, right? We, as a public, we became aware that there were some people that were greater risk than others. And it was tied to their being essential workers, that's an occupational exposure. It was tied to people with respiratory diseases, pre-existing conditions, immunological diseases, neurological diseases. And those people were warned that they were at higher risk, elderly, young people, etc. That was out there in the public conversation. There was an awareness that it wasn't a question of averaging population groups and a normalized effect across the population. We, in that moment, recognized that we did have differing population groups, differing exposure patterns, different responses. That is not incorporated into EPA's review. EPA does not look at people with pre-existing conditions when it does its analysis of cancer. If I'm undergoing chemotherapy for, you know, whatever the cancer is, I am not part of the normalized population group that EPA is evaluating for. EPA is not looking at the worst case scenario among the population out there. So I'm on my own. We've gotten calls from people, you know, we got a call once from a woman who said, my husband's in chemotherapy and they just installed a pentachlorophenol treated utility pole in front of my home. And we are sitting in our living room and we are inhaling, we can smell the off-gassing of that brand new utility pole in front of our house. And so that scenario repeats itself over and over and over again, and it's just dismissed as some sort of anomaly or something that's outside the concern of the agency and falls into this bucket, which I don't think is adequately calculated, but this bucket of acceptable risk. And when you delve into acceptable risk, you find that even in that context, we haven't fully defined it. So again, the alternatives for us is, the alternative is finding a system of management that gets to the outcome that we're looking for in that regulatory review process. So if I come to you as a manufacturer and say, hey, we have a new chemical we need for weed control because the other chemicals are no longer working, weed resistance, or we have a new insecticide, insect resistance, no longer working, the question is, are there alternatives that are not toxic, literally not toxic? And the answer is yes. And so that's our goal. And we're taking this around the country to communities all over the United States, in which communities are adopting these local reform policies where they're adopting this mindset. And they've got expert testimony through their regulatory legislative process from we're talking about the city council level, the county council level, and they're sort of delving into what do we know about these chemicals we're using in our community. They get scientists to testify, like you're hearing today, right? And you guys are the experts. You know, what do we know about these chemicals? What do we know about glyphosate? What is this controversy I've heard about glyphosate? Why is the IARC saying it's a carcinogen and EPA is saying it isn't? What does the independent scientific literature say? And then the city official looks at you and says, well, I'm not a scientist. I have to rely on EPA because I'm not a scientist. And that's where the independent science becomes so critically important, because the city officials, the elected officials, are thirsty to hear from independent scientists. Yeah, we hear a lot about, you know, dismissing scientists, dismissing science, alternative facts and all that. We have a crisis of that in our society. But our finding, what we experience at the local level, is that when you're speaking before a local official and you've got the scientists up there talking about the limitations of the regulatory system, what good science looks like, what the findings are, and then you have juxtaposed to that a land manager who can say to that city council members, we can manage your ball fields, your open space, your rights of way. We can educate your community members on how to manage landscapes without toxic chemicals. A lot of city officials stand up and say, so why would we introduce this toxic threat into our community? Which is exactly what's going on in the European Union, which is taking a precautionary approach. I want to back up the slide for one moment, and I'll give it back to you, Akela. One more. We had a glimpse of a precautionary approach for one moment under the Obama administration in 2016, when the Fish and Wildlife Service put out this notice. We have determined that the prophylactic use, such as a seed treatment of neonicotinoid and pesticides that can distribute systemically to a plant and can potentially affect a broad spectrum of non-target species, is not consistent with Fish and Wildlife Service policy. We make this decision based on a precautionary approach to our wildlife management practices and not on agricultural practices. If we took this approach for human beings, a precautionary approach, and asked the question, had these community meetings, this is a groundswell, a grassroots, bottom-up approach, we would embrace this across the country. That will filter up to state level policy and eventually federal policy, and we will solve some of these crises, these really existential crises that we're facing. So I'm going to leave my part of this presentation on a really upbeat note. Now that we've worked for decades to show the industry and to show the regulators and to show the local elected officials and increasingly state officials, this evening I'm testifying in the Nevada Senate before the Committee on Natural Resources on this whole issue. It's related to bees, it's not related to cancer, but it's premised on the idea that we're not adequately protected by the current regulatory system in place. So as this filters up, I think we have a real chance to solve these existential crises for the next generation. So that's our upbeat message for today. And then, Akela, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, just to finish out, we have some action steps that you can take to protect your community, like determining who's responsible for pest control and local ordinances. You can also initiate data collection, including information on specific insects, rodents, or weeds that are a problem in your area and what toxic chemicals may be used to control, and finding viable alternatives, and also just educating yourselves on the alternatives. Additionally, there are things that what you scientists can do to advocate in communities, was just buy organic, plant organic, start a petition so we can get the word out there. Additionally, you can also help by staying up to date with what we do. So we have our actions of the weeks, our daily news articles, which we talk about different health effects and pesticides, or even regulatory decisions. And you can stay up to date with different rulings and decision makings on regulation.gov on various pesticides. So these are our social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, which has a lot of our old conferences on there, which you can watch, which are very informational. And we do, I believe, have some conferences that specifically talk about cancer and pesticides, and in addition to our Instagram and our LinkedIn. We do a lot of work with other organizations, and we have a lot of resources on our website ourselves. So these are some of the things that we have worked on with other organizations and stuff that we have ourselves, such as the Maui Hub that we have in Hawaii. And then lastly, just questions and answers. And here are some citations. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Akela and Jay. That was a great presentation. I know that it's 101, but I would like to, if you have to jump off, I understand this is being recorded so you can access it all, but I did want to mention that we have Amanda Chimkowski, who is one of our colleagues at Women for a Healthy Environment. And so I just wanted to, if you could unmute yourself and turn your video on, Amanda.
Now that's the thing, is that
to
Jim
turn
was
it
under the
over
impression
to
it probably should
turn
be
it over to you
on
for a minute.
wireless rather
If
than the
you have
wire,
any
because there might
thoughts
be
or additional
maybe some type
comments
of
about
connectivity issue
pesticide
putting it
related
on
issues
the
or
wire, but they're
initiatives
the same subject.
going on here in our region. Am I hearing feedback?
Okay.
All right.
Yeah, sorry.
So,
Hi, thank you,
Okay,
Kayla and
you-
Jay,
if
for
we're
your
gonna
great
have it on the wireless-
presentation. I got a lot of really great information from that. So I guess for some background, we're a nonprofit in Pittsburgh that does a lot of environmental work.
well, that was the
so,
thing. We were letting it go and pull its own IP.
In terms of Pittsburgh,
it was
from my knowledge, there's no
to
official
get
policy
stuff
on
that
pesticide
time
use.
wire.
When I was talking with some organizations that do
And so that's
the
what-
work in the parks
Yeah, we
here.
just thought that's what we had to work
So
with.
it's really interesting to hear all of the specific data and get some more resources to look into that specifically. And Jay, that you mentioned that you're actually working with Pittsburgh. I would be interested to find out a little bit more of what that work looks like.
You tried, you tried.
But
Yeah, it's in
I really enjoyed hearing about the public health focus of
Yeah, our guy
everything.
tried.
Looking
I
at
came
the
in-
co-exposures here in Pittsburgh, especially, there are a lot of environmental health concerns.
Yes.
And as we all know, like, one environmental hazard does not exist in a vacuum. So
Yeah,
really
that's what
looking
we
at that
think.
as a public health issue, as
Yeah,
one of
the
many
one
things
he-
people are exposed to. Another thing we really keep in mind here is that we work with a lot of environmental justice communities. So there's a lot of different factors that play into the environmental health and use of pesticides here. So something we would like to see is the city of Pittsburgh actually adopt a official policy that does put organic first, reduces the reliance on synthetic pesticides, and especially in public spaces, since we have over 150 parks.
Where that stuff is.
So thank you both for your presentation today.
This is called.
Okay, so Jay and Akela, do you have a few minutes? There were just a couple questions.
Can I just quickly say, was it Amanda speaking? Can I get your email address or send it through Andre? And I'd love to share with you the plan we put together for some demonstration sites in Pittsburgh on parks. I think there has been some turnover in the parks, there's some retirements, which is an ongoing issue, but I'd love to get that, make sure that program is at least resurrected if it has fallen by the wayside. So let's talk about that and follow up on that.
Yeah, I would love that. I did just put my email in the chat for you.
Okay, thank you.
So are we okay to do a couple questions? Akela and Jay, are you okay on time?
Yeah,
Okay,
I apologize for going over.
Tina, I know Tina Higgins is here with us. Tina, did you have a question that you wanted to?
Ooh. Hey, Mia, how are you?
Good, good.
That's good. No, I really didn't have any questions. I love listening
I thought
to
you had unmuted and started to ask something. That's why I just wanted to give you the opportunity.
Oh, no, I'd like to thank everybody for being there, and I love the information. Thank you all so much. It's fantastic.
Okay, great, Tina. All right, so I'm just gonna jump into, there's a couple questions. What's the difference between organic certification standards for agricultural products versus eco-certified?
Yeah, there are a lot of voluntary standards out there. There's rainforest certified, there's, you're all familiar with fair trade. New York State there's some standard that groups have started around apple production. The only nationally certified program that is subject to public hearing and comment, governed by a stakeholder board, with a definition of what organic is and allowed, as I pointed out, allowed materials. So unfortunately, as these other labels crop up, I think they become confusing in the marketplace, and they can change at any point in time, as can the federal. There's no question that, as you know, from tracking federal law, regulations change. But it is a system that is transparent. And we just, for instance, 2 weeks ago, had one of 2 meetings every year of the National Organic Standards Board, and it's open to the public. All the recommendations are vetted through a public comment period and then eventually published in the Federal Register. The other standards you see out there on food don't have that same sort of public process and are not governed by, a national system of any sort. So, yeah, I mean, I think it becomes difficult to make an individual judgment as a consumer as to what the value of that label actually is. But that's where we are in the marketplace now, because a lot of people feel, rightly so, that the existing regulatory system is not adequately protective, and they want to, as producers, as growers, be able to advertise to us, the consumers, that they're going above and beyond what is required by law. Unfortunately, it's really hard to evaluate all of those. There's no required inspection. It's usually a self-certification process, with the exception of organic. And could organic be better? Could it be stronger? Could it be better funded? Yes. I mean, we are involved constantly trying to get additional money for enforcement and, transition, helping farmers make the transition to organic. So we want to get the scientific community really highly engaged in this process. As a result, born out of your intimate knowledge of what the limitations are of the regulatory process that allows all this contamination, be it food contamination or soil, air, water, whatever it is. So hopefully I answered your question, but it is difficult right now, with the exception of organic. I think people, because of the confusion, people say, well, how can you be sure it's organic? Well, you've got a label and a process and an enforcement system that you don't have with any other label. And by the way, on the conventional chemical side, when people say, how do you know it's organic? And how do you know there's compliance with the standard, et cetera? Organic is the only food production system in the US that has certification and inspection. You go to the grocery store and buy an apple, any food commodity that's not labeled organic, there's no inspection system for that. There's no record keeping that is evaluated by regulators. In most states, I mean, there's some exceptions, like California has some kind of reporting system, which is limited. There's no reporting on what's been used in production of that crop. An organic farmer has to keep records of what was used. What's the systems plan? How did I manage this? How did I manage that? So we're in a situation now, I think, as I described, we're in transition. And the more public pressure we see to get these chemicals out of our food production system, out of our parks, the more we'll see the growth of organic. Even the Secretary of Agriculture is investing more money than ever before in organic transition.
Okay, thank you. Next one, back in the day, pesticides found to cause or induce cancer were banned via regulation of food additives. In 1996, pesticides were exempt from that. It seems crazy that chemicals known to cause cancer are allowed on food. Do you see any opportunity for a focus on cancer to resurrect this ban?
I guess the short answer is not with this Congress, right, that we have. I think is this your question, Polly? I think what you're referring to here really is the Delaney Clause, which is a 1958 law that basically said any carcinogen that concentrates in processed food should be banned. And as a result of a lawsuit from NRDC in the 90s that they won, EPA had never implemented that law fully. And so they were required, and they started taking carcinogens, cancer-causing pesticides, out of use. And it caused, as you can imagine, quite an uproar because the food production folks, the big food folks, and those in the in the chemical industry, they basically said the whole food system's going to collapse, and it became a whole big thing. So the response to that was, oh, I guess, and that, remember, that was back in the early or mid 90s, or really early 90s. And at that time, you couldn't really say that we could shift to organic. It didn't exist at the level that it does today. We didn't have at that time the label in the grocery store. We had different competing standards across the state. So to say we can get all carcinogens out and maintain food production at the level that is required was a little bit of a stretch, I would admit, at that time. So the compromise was to leverage that standard. And by the way, when we say concentration of carcinogens in food, you think, well, that doesn't affect the whole food supply because that would only affect processed foods. Well, it turns out that when you regulate processed foods, you basically regulate all food production, with very few exceptions, like lettuce and other foods that aren't processed either through heating, milling, or some sort of process that causes concentration. And when you take water out, extract liquid from a processed food, you're concentrating any residues that are in the food. And when we looked at this, we found that virtually all food commodities in the marketplace, except the fresh fruit commodities, would not be directly affected, but the fresh fruit commodities would be directly affected because all growers produce for both the fresh and the processed market. I get my highest price in the fresh market. If I can't sell to the fresh market my apples, I sell my apples for applesauce. So I cannot add a carcinogen under the Delaney clause if I want to be in the processed market. And I do. I need to be to make ends meet and to break even or to make a profit. So with that law on the chopping block, many in the environmental community decided, let's see what we can do to leverage a stronger FIFRA. And the reason I say amendments to FIFRA and the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is because pesticide residues in food are technically registered under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. They have a memorandum of understanding with EPA to regulate residues and evaluate residues. But at the end of the day, FDA sets the residue that EPA establishes. So we're talking about an amendment in 1996 that traded the Delaney clause, which was no carcinogens in food, essentially, for an improvement, as it was thought, to risk assessment. And it was really fascinating because the science was so fully integrated. It was, you'd think a federal agency would be able to figure this out and should have figured it out, but it took the Congress to sit down and say to EPA, under the statute, the Food Quality Protection Act, which was traded for the Delaney clause, to say that we're going to stipulate to you that you must do the following. You must look at common mechanism of toxicity. So that means you must look at all organophosphates, which have a common mechanism of toxicity. First, you have to figure out which families of chemicals have a common mechanism of toxicity, and then you need to regulate them as a group and look at cumulative risk. That was revolutionary at the time, no question about it. It was revolutionary because they were looking at individual chemicals and not adding up all the risks from all the exposures. And then you needed to look at, synthetic pyrethroids as a group, look at organochlorines as a group. There's still organochlorines, not as many today, but there were many back then that were still used. So it was an improvement from a risk assessment perspective. But then there's that chart Akela had up about all the things we don't look at, which since then the Inspector General has looked at. There were problems with conditional registration, which was an early entry into the market with unanswered questions that EPA said we'll get to later, but never did. That's how we got the crisis with bees, because all the neonicotinoids were originally registered as under conditional registration, and we hadn't looked at all the data on bees, and the agency had in its files, this is known to kill bees. We need to study bees. And the market exploded with all these neonicotinoids before EPA had the data. And we're still struggling with that problem today because, of course, the horse had left the barn and we couldn't get there, or the toothpaste is out of the tube, whatever, analogy you want to use there. And we can't get it back because the market has become so dependent on these chemicals. So ever since then, I think, and Polly, you probably have insights into this, I think we've become even more dependent on risk assessment as a tool, and we talk less about these uncertainties than we used to. We used to have an EPA administrator at least standing up and saying, well, we think the risks are acceptable, but there still are some uncertainties. They would at least acknowledge the uncertainties. Today, we don't even talk about uncertainties anymore. We just have rolled that into allowable risks and acceptable risks, and we've sort of brushed them aside. And we don't even talk about endocrine disruption as a limitation, at least within the agency. But there is an Inspector General report on endocrine disruption. We had done a report about 4 years ago, and it's really, and then Inspector General came to visit us and they talked to a whole bunch of other people, and they wrote a really good report on the failure of EPA to carry out its statutory duty to evaluate endocrine disruption. So, we've moved away from these absolutes, no carcinogens, no neurotoxic chemicals that affect the brain in children, something like that. We have really accepted these risks with a lot of, I think, disinformation or misinformation around what it really means to our health overall from a public health perspective. And that's why we started the pesticide-induced diseases database, because we were really frustrated being dependent on EPA's analysis as the only basis for what's going on out there. And then we started seeing all these studies, mostly epidemiologic studies around Parkinson's and pesticides and cancer and pesticides. We saw elevated rates of cancer in farmers that use 2,4-D, and they really started to pile up. And we said, well, we really should try to collect all these public health diseases that have a connection to pesticides. And I still can't believe it every time I sit down and look. Kayla manages this thing. She mentioned there are about 1,100 or 1,200 studies in there now. If we had the resources to really track this as well as we really should, I'm sure that would quadruple overnight easily. But I think what we're at least showing is that there's a pattern of real world experiences and studies that are showing that these low level exposures that we've been very dismissive of, and that the lack of attention to mixtures and synergy and vulnerable population groups, that they're starting to show up in more and more studies, independent scientific, studies that EPA doesn't capture. I always wonder why is EPA not following the literature that we're seeing? Why can't they take a study on 2,4-D and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma that's in the scientific literature over and over and over again, or glyphosate, and why? Because they're depending, when EPA says, we looked at IARC and we looked at they went back to their database, which has come from the manufacturer, and they're evaluating the cancer effect in the protocol, the study that they studied under the registration requirements for registration. But they're not taking in the whole body of scientific literature. That's what IARC did. IARC looked much more broadly at the scientific literature, and they come up with a possible cancer, a probable cancer rating, which is the highest rating you can get without doing human studies, as you know. I mean, I'm talking to people who know this stuff. So, we're in a situation where we have these sort of a tweaking of the risk assessment process, which we've understood to be deficient. And we recognize, by virtue of Inspector General report, GAO, that we are not looking at all the health outcomes, even all those that are required by law. And where does that leave us? I mean, and meanwhile, the literature that we're tracking The independent literature is showing escalating risk factors and more connections of these exposures back to these adverse health effects and outcomes. It's a very frustrating, and you can see why we end up with, screw it. Let's just change the way we manage land. Let's just change the way we grow food. We've shown that we no longer need these things. And if we could get that into Congress and the minds of, those, I mean, obviously we have a whole alternative market now, and we work with a lot of these guys. We've got Stonyfield. We have a company out in the West, Natural Grocers, that only sells organic. We have, we have some problems with some of the bigger companies on the East Coast that started out as organic, and now you can find only a fraction organic. I won't name the names, but, and then we have a new up and coming, I don't think it's made it to Pennsylvania yet. Oh, yeah, it has, but Eastern Pennsylvania, it's called Mom's Organic Market. And so, which is all organic, and they are now in the Philly area. They started out in DC. So we are going to start to see more and more stores, I believe, that are saying, we don't trust this regulatory system. We want to only carry organic. Now, finally, that means that we as a community have to really get more involved with this organic system. And if somebody comes to the National Organic Standards Board and says, we've got this new safe synthetic material that we want to be allowed in organic, we have to be at the table, and we can be at the table. But nobody's showing up. I mean, not enough people are showing up. And I'm always trying to wrangle people, come to the next meeting, the NOSB. We're trying to bring scientists into that conversation, because we have, believe me, you can imagine, given the cost differential and the profit margin for companies that are selling organic right now, because they're a limited market, more limited market, they can demand a higher price. The big food wants into this market. They want a piece of this market. And big food has controlled this whole system over on the FIFRA side, over on the EPA side. So guess what? They want into this market. They're used to controlling. They're used to working under FDA standards. They want all grass chemicals allowed in organic. That is not allowed in organic. Grass does not meet, generally recognized as safe, does not meet the organic standard. There's a whole different set of parameters around grass that has all kinds of limitations. Even standards under EPA exemptions, where they say we don't need a tolerance because we believe this pesticide is safe. That does not meet the organic standards. So what does big food want to do? Big food comes in, they say, FDA has already told you that this chemical is generally recognized as safe, and we have to explain to them over and over and over, that does not meet the organic standard. That is not the same as organic review. And guess what they're trying to do? Change the organic standard to allow grass or to allow something to weaken that organic standard. So we really need scientific support to maintain these strong standards so that we don't lose the solution as I see it. I don't know.
It's a good segue to the last question, Jay, and
Okay.
thank you for staying, because this is being recorded, and so this information will live on, and I think it's
Okay.
really valuable for people. But the last question is, how do we address the higher cost of organic food
Yeah.
for people with fewer resources? They are
Yeah.
both exposed to higher levels of pesticides and often not able to afford organically produced food.
Yeah, this is a systemic problem. The way we view it is that there's a social justice component to organic, because if I live in a frontline community, I'm being exposed to the pesticides not only through my food supply, but through the emissions that are associated with that production facility that I'm living next to. If I live in Palestine, Ohio, I have trains coming through my backyard, and I see accidents across the United States, not only my community, of these materials. And methyl chloride is in pesticides as a contaminant, as an inert ingredient. So even though that's not the primary use, so I am suffering as a result of. So there's a social justice component to pesticide dependency. And until we recognize that our food supply dependent on chemicals is having a disproportionate impact, as Akela mentioned, on low-income communities and people of color, we are not going to realize the systemic change that needs to take place. We're subsidizing chemical agriculture, and so we're subsidizing the poisoning of people of color. Okay, so that's all well and good. That's a systemic problem. We're not going to change that certainly overnight. So we have grappled with this question. And I can tell you that there are ways around the cost. We have something on our website, I think it's called The Affordability of Organic. A book was written on this subject. It's not as easy as going into your store. It takes some creativity around farmers markets. And there are even some recipes in this book we recommend that are lower cost. And so it's really an unfortunate situation, but I think we have to start seeing this as an environmental justice issue. The burden should not be on people of color to pay a higher price to protect themselves because they're already suffering from elevated risk factors. All the essential workers and the disproportionate deaths in the African-American community to COVID as a result of disproportionate numbers of people of color being essential workers is also tied to all these chemical exposures, because their elevated risk factors, as Akela pointed out, are related to these exposure patterns and transgenerational epigenetic effects that are carried over from generation to generation. So there's no silver bullet answer to this question, but it also shouldn't be a reason to not support organic. If we could get all the wealthy people and moderate income people that can afford organic in this country to shift to organic, that would lower the price of organic because it would create greater demand in the market and it would incentivize a shift to organic. But I'll tell you one last story. I used to do this class every summer for inner city kids. It was actually a class EPA taught, brought kids together. I don't think they do it anymore. And so I came in and did one day and did a talk with these kids, and they're all inner city kids. And I asked them, how many kids in here eat organic? And I swear, 80% of the kids in the room raised their hand. How many of their parents buy organic? And there have been studies done that lower income people are more in tune with this. They recognize that it affects their health. They spend a disproportionate amount of their budget on food. They want healthy diets for their kids. And now this was maybe a more educated subset of the inner city population. They obviously went to the trouble to get their kids into this program, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there are a lot of factors that may be at play here, but I think we have the opportunity here to leverage this. We've been talking to the administration, the Biden administration. They have a social justice, environmental justice screen that's supposed to be evaluated across all federal agencies. They have a scorecard now that they announced last Friday of environmental justice. What is your agency doing for environmental justice? This is a topic that must be a part of that environmental justice question. All people should have access to organic food, especially those at disproportionate risk to chemical exposures. So that's my answer, at least at this stage.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jay and Akela, for being here. Like I said, I know everybody's left us, but
yeah,
many people are going to access this recording, and so thank you for taking the extra time with us.
And I apologize for going over.
No, it's great information. I'm thankful that you were able to stay. And I'll go ahead and mention, even though everybody's gone because of the recording, that we are planning a two-part series for our next topic to look at the East Palestine train derailment. And part 2 will be covering updates in train safety and how new regulations will impact the health of communities. So looking forward to that. We don't have the dates yet, but hopefully everybody will be able to join us for that. So I think that's it then, right?
Well,
So,
thank you guys. And thank you, Polly,
right.
for
Thank you.
getting us an invite here. We really appreciate the opportunity. And I really will circle back to Pittsburgh and find out exactly where we're at with the program. I know at the time we did a day and a half training and provided them with a plan, the park system, and they were really into it. So if the program has, curtailed to some degree or has even faded away, we need to get that thing reinvigorated. So I will, and I know Andre's interested in this as well, so
Absolutely.
I
Yeah, I
told
know the
him I
network would
talk
be very interested in supporting that. And there's lots of strong representation now at the county level as well, on the county council, that are allies on this. So
Yeah.
city, county, yeah, let's stay in touch.
And I should have mentioned that we, believe it or not, we were able to generate funding so that we can, at no cost, go, like as we did in Pittsburgh, go into a community, bring a horticulturalist in, and put this plan together. We'll do the soil testing, the evaluation. We'll do a site visit. During COVID, we did this remotely with visual photography and so forth. But the challenge we always have is not the money, because we have the money. Often you go to a city council, say, we want to do this. They say, well, we don't have the budget for it. And then we say, well, we have the money we can provide to you to do this. So that's not a barrier. But the barrier is that people, as you know, you've seen this, people are trained in managing systems with chemicals. That's their orientation. They're trained in agricultural universities to grow food with chemicals. Same thing on lawn care, horticultural schools, they're taught to use chemicals. So there's resistance often. It wasn't true in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh got the message. They were interested at the time anyway. So I put that out there. If the network wants to work with us in communities across Pennsylvania or Western Pennsylvania, let's collaborate on that, and we can, find communities that would like to transition their land management to organic land management practices. So just put that out there as an offer, and I'll follow up with Andre on that as well.
All right, thank you
Okay.
very much. Appreciate it. That's it. All right.
Let's
Thanks
stay in
again.
touch.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye,
Thank you.
Kayla.
care.
Bye, Jay. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Mia.